June 24, 2025, 2 p.m., Florida State Prison. After nearly 30 years on death row, a man was put to death for a crime that still haunts the city of Orlando. His name was Thomas Lee Gudinas. His victim was Michelle McGrath, a 22-year-old woman who had just left a downtown nightclub in April of 1994. She never made it home. The case was brutal. The details chilling. But what made it even more unsettling was what came afterward. A decades-long legal battle involving questions of sanity, responsibility, and whether justice delayed had truly been justice at all. According to investigators, Michelle had been out with friends that night, nothing out of the ordinary. She danced. She laughed. She left early to head home. Security footage showed her walking alone to her car in a parking garage. She never got in. Police say Thomas followed her, quietly, strategically, then disappeared into the dark. By morning, her body was found in a stairwell. There were no signs of a robbery, no weapons recovered. No clear motive except that she had been alone, and he had been watching. The suspect didn't take long to find. Just hours later, Thomas was arrested for unrelated behavior nearby, running through the streets in just his underwear, waving at traffic. He made no sense, offered no explanation, and was immediately flagged for psychiatric evaluation. But what began as erratic behavior would quickly evolve into something far more serious. A search of his apartment revealed items belonging to Michelle. DNA linked him to the scene, and most shockingly, Thomas confessed, not once, not under pressure, but voluntarily, repeatedly. He even reenacted parts of the crime for detectives, emotionless and detached. From there, the story grew darker. His background came into focus. A childhood filled with instability, over 100 transfers between institutions, long-term mental health issues, and a history of being unmedicated during critical moments. Yet despite all that, the court ruled him competent to stand trial. The jury found him guilty, and the judge handed down the harshest penalty allowed by law, death. For the next 3 decades, the case would be appealed, delayed, and reviewed over and over. Supporters of capital punishment called it justice too long delayed. Opponents argued it was cruel, given Thomas's mental state and isolation. When the final date was set, Thomas made no statements. No appeals, no spiritual advisor, no family. He walked alone the same way Michelle had 3 decades earlier. This is the story of a case that raises questions even after its final chapter. Not just about guilt or innocence, but about how far the justice system should go. When the mind behind Thomas Lee Gudinas didn't grow up in the type of household that makes headlines, not at first. Born in 1966, he entered a world already unstable. His early years were marked by constant movement, emotional neglect, and a lack of structure. Records show he was transferred between homes, facilities, and institutions more than 100 times before the age of 18. That number is not a typo. It became a statistic that would follow him for life. His school history was fragmented. He rarely stayed in one district long enough to form relationships or receive sustained education. Teachers noted he was often distracted, unable to focus, and sometimes seemed confused, not defiant, just detached. Medical records indicate that Thomas had been diagnosed with a series of behavioral and cognitive disorders throughout adolescence. He showed signs of paranoia, delusion, and significant mood swings. At times, he believed people were following him. At others, he spoke to voices no one else could hear. But his mental health was never treated consistently. Medications were prescribed, then stopped. Facilities shifted. Paperwork was lost. No one owned the problem, they just passed it along. By the time Thomas reached adulthood, he was already deep into a system that didn't know what to do with him. He lived in halfway homes, shelters, and on occasion, with relatives who were unequipped to handle his condition. Jobs never lasted. Relationships never started. His life became a series of quiet breakdowns that no one seemed to notice. Then came 1994. In the weeks leading up to the incident involving Michelle McGrath, witnesses described Thomas as vacant. He was seen walking aimlessly through Orlando's downtown area, muttering to himself. One store clerk said he entered a convenience shop, stood in front of the soda aisle for 15 minutes and walked out without buying anything. Police reports from that month, completely unrelated to Michelle's case, documented odd but non-violent behavior. He was once found sitting on a curb at 3 a.m. staring into the street. When officers approached, he asked them if they could turn the lights down because the sky was too loud. No arrests were made. No psychiatric follow-up occurred, people noticed, but no one intervened. And so the patterns repeated. Isolation deepened. Stability disappeared. Later, during court proceedings, mental health professionals would testify that Thomas had likely been living with untreated schizoaffective disorder for over a decade. They said the signs had been there for years, long before the night Michelle disappeared. But at the time, there was no mandatory treatment, no sustained oversight, just a man falling through every crack the system had. By the time he encountered Michelle, his grip on reality had already unraveled. He wasn't a stranger to the city. He had lived in Orlando on and off, staying in temporary housing, relying on soup kitchens and shelters. But no one really knew him not well. He was just another quiet face in a crowded street. And in many ways, that's what made him invisible. He didn't make noise. He didn't cause problems. He simply wandered. Until one night, when wandering turned into something irreversible. What followed would become one of Florida's most disturbing cases, not just because of what happened, but because of all the missed chances to stop it. Thomas didn't wake up dangerous. He wasn't born that way. He was shaped over years of neglect, untreated. It was April 1994. Downtown Orlando was buzzing with nightlife, music, neon lights, people flowing in and out of bars. Among them was Michelle McGrath, 22 years old, dressed casually, out with friends to unwind after work. She left early, alone. Michelle exited the club around 2 a.m., walking toward the parking garage where she had left her car. The garage wasn't far, just across the street. Surveillance footage showed her entering the structure. Calm. Unaware, Thomas Gudinas was also nearby. Witnesses later said he had been lingering outside the club for hours, not talking to anyone, just watching. Security guards had noticed him before. He was odd but not threatening. They let it go. That decision would haunt them later. The final image of Michelle on camera showed her turning a corner inside the garage. She never came back out. By 6 a.m., her friends had grown concerned. Calls went unanswered. One of them drove to the garage and found her car still parked. Locked, untouched, but no sign of Michelle. Police were called. A search began. It didn't take long. A few levels below, in a stairwell mostly used for maintenance access, they found her. Unresponsive, no sign of robbery. No attempt to conceal the scene, just silence. At first, there were no suspects. The crime had occurred late. There were no witnesses. No one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary, or so it seemed. But then something strange happened. Later that same morning, officers responded to a call about a man walking down the street wearing only underwear. He was erratic, talking to himself, waving at cars. Officers approached him for his own safety. It was Thomas Gudinas. He was detained for observation, not for any connection to Michelle, at least not yet, but within hours inconsistencies emerged. Thomas had scratches on his arms. He offered strange, contradictory explanations about where he had been. Then, seemingly unprompted, he mentioned a girl, a parking garage, and a stairwell nobody goes into. That was all it took. A search warrant was issued for his residence. Inside, they found personal belongings that were later matched to Michelle. A forensic investigation confirmed physical evidence that placed Thomas at the scene. And then came the confession. In taped interviews, Thomas recounted the events of that night, not as if he were reliving them, but as if he had read them somewhere. Cold, measured, detached, he told detectives he just followed her. Well, he didn't say why. He didn't claim anger or impulse, only that he saw her and followed. He described the stairwell in detail, described how no one would find her there until morning. He ended with, "It didn't take long, I didn't think it mattered." No emotion, no explanation. At trial, prosecutors described the incident as opportunistic. The defense, however, argued that Thomas was in the middle of a severe psychiatric episode, incapable of distinguishing fantasy from reality. That his actions were not calculated but disconnected from logic altogether. But one fact couldn't be argued: Michelle never made it home, and Thomas had placed himself exactly where she disappeared. From the moment Thomas Gudinas began talking, investigators knew they were dealing with more than just a confession. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't emotional. He simply told them what happened step by step as if he were reading from a script. But police didn't stop at his words. They needed evidence, something that would hold up in court regardless of mental state. They started with surveillance footage. Michelle had been captured on camera leaving the club, walking toward the parking garage and entering the structure alone. Thomas appeared minutes later, heading in the same direction. The timing was exact. Their paths never crossed on camera again. Next came the forensic search. Inside Thomas's residence, a small, sparsely furnished apartment, police found items that raised concern. A compact mirror, a keychain, and a scarf. Michelle's friends confirmed these had belonged to her. Lab testing later found trace DNA that matched both Michelle and Thomas on multiple surfaces. In the stairwell where Michelle had been found, investigators collected fibers and fingerprints. Several prints matched Thomas. Others were smudged, partial, but consistent with someone having leaned or paused along the railing. Most telling was a single footprint, faint but visible, in the dust-covered corner near where her body had been discovered. It matched the pattern on Thomas's shoes. They also examined his clothing. The shirt he wore the night of the arrest showed trace evidence consistent with debris from the stairwell, dust particles, building material, and microscopic fibers from concrete that lined the steps. Then came interviews. A nearby bartender recalled seeing Thomas earlier in the evening, sitting alone, drinking water, not interacting with anyone. "He just watched people," the bartender said. "Didn't blink much, didn't talk, just sat there." Another witness, a friend of Michelle's, remembered noticing someone lurking across the street while the group was outside the club. At the time, it hadn't felt threatening, just unusual. But after the fact, that moment took on new weight. Perhaps most valuable was Thomas's own demeanor. He never denied being at the garage. He never asked for a lawyer. He simply answered questions, calmly, directly, and often in unsettling detail. Detectives noted how his tone never changed. Whether he was describing where he walked or how long he waited, it all sounded the same, flat, disconnected. During a psychiatric evaluation ordered shortly after his arrest, doctors described Thomas as exhibiting blunted affect, a condition where emotional expression is minimal or absent, often seen in individuals with severe mental health disorders. He was found to be oriented, able to understand questions, and capable of recalling events clearly. That led prosecutors to conclude he was competent both to confess and to stand trial. But the defense team disagreed. They argued that Thomas's lack of reaction wasn't proof of clarity, but a symptom of long untreated mental illness. They pointed to his history: more than 100 institutional transfers, frequent hallucinations, and a complete absence of stable care. Still, the investigation had its facts. The physical evidence, the timeline, the confession. To the state, it was enough. To others, it was complicated. Because while Thomas never denied being there, and never disputed what happened, the question remained: did he understand the gravity of what he had done? That question would follow the case into court. By the time the trial began, the facts of the case were clear. Thomas Gudinas had followed Michelle McGrath into a parking garage. He had entered the stairwell where she was later found. He had confessed multiple times. But the real battle wasn't about what happened. It was about why it happened and whether Thomas truly understood the weight of the prosecution's case. The state of Florida painted the incident as a calculated act. Prosecutors argued that Thomas had observed Michelle for some time, waited until she was alone, and chose to follow her into a space where no one would see what took place. They emphasized his knowledge of the stairwell, a place rarely used hidden from cameras. They called it intentional, planned, not spontaneous. They acknowledged his history of mental illness but insisted that mental illness alone does not equal legal insanity. Their experts testified that Thomas was able to understand right from wrong, that his confession was coherent, that he could recall events in order, that he even expressed awareness that others would be upset when they found out what had happened. To the prosecution, this wasn't someone out of touch with reality. This was someone making choices and understanding their consequences. In closing arguments, the lead prosecutor told the jury, "We don't punish people for being sick, but we do hold them accountable when their choices take another life." They sought the defense's argument. The defense team didn't dispute Thomas's presence at the scene. They didn't argue that someone else had committed the crime. Instead, they focused entirely on his mind. They brought in psychiatric records from his childhood, documentation of over 100 facility transfers, inconsistent treatment, and recurring symptoms of psychosis. They described his behavior not as evil, but as the unraveling of someone who had never received stable care. Their mental health experts testified that Thomas suffered from a chronic schizoaffective disorder, characterized by delusions, auditory hallucinations, and emotional disconnection. They said his confession wasn't cold, it was symptomatic. That his calm tone reflected flat affect, not clarity. They pointed to his behavior after the incident, wandering the streets disoriented, undressed, engaging in nonsensical speech. The defense argued that Thomas lived in a reality of his own making, not out of denial, but because his brain could no longer anchor him to the world others shared. They did not ask for freedom. They asked for life in prison with psychiatric treatment. One attorney stated, "Punishment won't fix what society failed to address, but executing someone who's the verdict." After days of testimony and emotional argument, the jury deliberated. Their decision was unanimous, guilty on all counts. And with that, the sentence, death. To some, it was long overdue accountability. To others, it was a missed opportunity for mercy. The judge acknowledged the tragedy on both sides. He noted that Michelle's life had been taken far too soon, but he also commented on Thomas's history, saying the system had failed to intervene until it was too late. Still, the law was clear. And so, a man with decades of documented mental illness. After the verdict, Thomas Gudinas was moved to Florida's death row, a facility known not just for its security, but for its silence. There, he would spend the next 3 decades, longer than the life of the woman whose death brought him there. His daily routine became one of repetition. Wake up, sit, eat, sleep, repeat. A cycle without variation, measured not in days but in legal delays. He was housed in solitary conditions with limited contact. He rarely spoke to others. When he did, correctional officers described his voice as low, flat, and mostly emotionless. He received mail occasionally, but he wrote back even less. No long letters, no public statements. No declarations of innocence or guilt, just silence. Over the years, attorneys filed multiple appeals on his behalf. Most centered around one question: was it lawful to execute someone with a long documented history of severe mental illness? Experts debated the issue at length. Some pointed to past evaluations declaring him competent. Others cited newer research suggesting that prolonged isolation had worsened his condition, making him less aware of reality with each passing year. One psychologist who evaluated him after nearly 2 decades inside stated that Thomas could no longer hold a coherent conversation. He responds when prompted, the report said, but offers no questions of his own. No reflections, just acknowledgement. In 2024, a final appeal was filed, arguing that his deteriorating mental state disqualified him from execution under constitutional standards. The appeal was denied. As the execution date approached, Thomas made no requests for media, family visits, or final statements. He declined to speak to spiritual advisors. He did not request special meals or possessions. He signed all forms presented to him with short, uneven strokes. According to prison staff, he spent his final days in near total quiet. He read occasionally, mostly older magazines left behind by other inmates. Sometimes he sat still for hours, facing the wall, blinking slowly as if waiting for something that never came. On the day of his scheduled sentence, Thomas did not resist. He did not cry. He did not say goodbye. His last recorded statement was, "I don't need anything." No family attended, no friends, only state witnesses, media, and legal observers, at 6:02 p.m. On June 24, 2025, the sentence was carried out, marking the end of a case that had begun more than 30 years earlier. Correctional officers later described the moment as unusually quiet, not because the process was different, but because the man at the center of it had remained unchanged for so long, many had forgotten he was even still there. There were no protests outside, no vigils, no last-minute headlines, just a quiet chamber. When the doors of Florida State Prison closed behind Thomas Gudinas for the last time, there was no national headline, no memorial, no protest. But the case didn't disappear. It remained as a name in court archives, as a statistic on a spreadsheet, and as a lingering question in conversations about justice, mental health, and responsibility. More than 30 years had passed since the night Michelle McGrath didn't come home. And yet, even after 3 decades, not everyone could agree on what her death and Thomas's execution truly meant. For some, the story was simple. A young woman's life was stolen. The man responsible was identified, convicted, and sentenced. Justice was delayed but eventually delivered. For others, it was more complicated. Thomas had a documented history of psychological instability long before that night in 1994. He had been moved through over 100 facilities, treated inconsistently, and released without structure. His condition had been noticed, but never fully addressed. Supporters of capital punishment argued that mental illness doesn't excuse accountability, especially when a life has been lost. But mental health advocates asked a different question. If someone's mind was broken before the crime, what exactly are we punishing? That question remained unanswered. The case also reignited debate over long-term solitary confinement. Thomas had spent nearly 30 years in isolation, a practice many argue worsens psychological decline. Should a man with no visitors, no contact, and no engagement for decades still be considered competent at the moment of death? The court said yes, the law held firm, but for many watching, something about it still didn't sit right. Michelle's family, meanwhile, largely stayed out of the media. In the rare public statement made, her father said, "We didn't wait for justice, we waited for peace, and we still don't have it." Some viewed Thomas's quiet execution as closure. Others saw it as a mirror, reflecting everything the system failed to do before it reached the point of no return. Because in the end, this wasn't just about one man or one night. It was about a system that missed the warnings, about a person who vanished in plain sight, and about what happens when tragedy becomes procedure. There are no easy answers. Only the weight of silence in the courtroom, in the prison cell, and in the stairwell where it all began. Thomas never asked for forgiveness. He never offered an apology. And perhaps most haunting of all, he never asked